Hello, my friends and followers. This is immigration attorney Joseph Patrick Murphy of Allegheny Immigration Group. I've got a video for you today about representing people who've come over the southern border. Anyone who's been watching the news over the past couple months has got to be aware that large numbers of people are entering the United States over the southern border. In many cases, these people don't have a visa. They're just coming to the border and asking to be admitted to the United States. They're making asylum claims and things of this sort. In this video, I'm going to discuss the legal complexities that are caused by this sort of entry and how we handle representing people who've come in that manner. And again, my name is Joseph Patrick Murphy. I'm an immigration attorney with Allegheny Immigration Group. My practice is primarily family-based and humanitarian immigration, and that includes things like people who cross the southern border seeking asylum in the United States. The office number here at Allegheny Immigration Group is 412-521-2000. My personal cell, text, WhatsApp, and Viber, they're all the same number, 412-973-3442. And I understand we've recently added accessibility on a new messaging app called IMO HD, or maybe it's IMO, I don't know. But it's a new app and I have it on my phone, so if you want to use that to call me, again, the number is 412-973-3442. That number rings right through to me. I'll be happy to take your call. People call me all the time, and you can too. But people who come over the southern border without a visa generally are being led into the United States for the purpose of filing for asylum. In order to get a better understanding, we have to talk a little bit about asylum claims and how they work. There are two really broad categories that every asylum claim in the United States goes in. One is what are called defensive asylum claims. Those are where the government is seeking to deport someone or remove them. The legal name for deportation is removal. And in the middle of the removal proceeding, the person to be removed says, you know what, I know I broke your immigration law, but please don't send me home because the home country is dangerous to people like me. That's a defensive asylum. The person's using asylum as a defense against deportation. The other type of asylum, and actually and historically this was the more common type of asylum claim, is what's called an affirmative asylum claim. This is where someone enters the United States lawfully with a visa, is in the United States, and while they're here and in lawful status, they decide to apply for asylum. That's called an affirmative asylum. Most of the people coming over the southern border are going to end up being placed into removal proceedings, and they're going to be filing defensive asylum claims. Defensive asylum claims have drastically different procedures than affirmative asylum claims. And because most of the asylum claims that have historically been made were affirmative claims, you're going to have a situation where this wave of immigrants is going to be talking with an earlier wave of immigrants that had a totally different experience with totally different procedures because the earlier wave was filing a different type of asylum claim. When you're filing an affirmative asylum claim, and again, this is for someone who entered lawfully with a visa and is already in the country legally, while they're here they apply for asylum, that's called the affirmative. And when you file an affirmative asylum claim, in many cases, you're filling out a form, mailing it to immigration, and complying with some other procedures. You get in a long line, usually several years, and eventually you'll be interviewed. That's not what's going to happen in a defensive case. It's not going to have all that time, you're not going to have all those privileges, and you're going to be talking to a judge, not an asylum service officer down in Virginia. You're going to be in an immigration court with a case to deport you. You'll be using asylum as a defense. But many of the people who are entering over the southern border to file asylum think they're going to be going through the same procedure that maybe a generation earlier of immigrants went through when they came in lawfully and went through the affirmative process. They're totally different processes, and in this video I'm going to talk about what the differences are and what you can expect. As I discussed earlier in this video, we're facing unprecedented levels of what you might call irregular immigration. Large numbers of people are coming into our country without visas, and they're being let in by Border Patrol for the purpose of making asylum claims. Because we're facing all this irregular immigration, we don't have the typical one-size-fits-all situation. Right now we're seeing at least 8 separate subgroups of people in the country that are coming in for immigration services, and the vast majorities of these are created by the irregular migration across the southern border. So first you have legally admitted and in legal status. That was most commonly what we saw all the time in the past. Legally admitted and out of status, that's the overstay, someone who comes on a student visa and when classes are over they don't go home. We also saw a lot of that in the past. That's pretty normal, common immigration stuff. And the third category are people who've been paroled. They haven't been admitted to the United States, but they came up to the border, asked to be admitted for the purposes of filing for asylum. They were screened by Border Patrol and found that it is possible for them to get it, and they're given parole. They're released into the United States with what's called a parole document. It's not an admission stamp, it's a parole document. But they're released into the United States for a year for the purpose of filing an asylum claim. Those first three categories of people, those could follow the old process, the affirmative process. They're not being deported. They've either been admitted or paroled. They're in the United States lawfully. They can all follow the process that the last generation of immigrants could follow. Everybody else is going to have to do a defense of asylum because they're being put through the court process. And I'll give you the examples of those other 5 categories. If you've been paroled into the United States and they impounded your passport, you're almost certainly going to have to go through a defensive proceeding. If you're paroled and given a court date, that will do it too. Court date is obviously a court date. In the court, they're seeking to deport you, so your asylum will be a defense. Next one is paroled, given a court date, and passport impounded. And then you get into people that aren't even paroled. These are arrested and released into the U.S. with court date, arrested and released into the U.S. with court date, and passport impounded. Those are the 8 categories we're seeing. So one of the first things you have to do when you're dealing with someone who entered over the southern border is see which one of those categories they're in. If they're in any but the first 3, they're going to be a defensive asylum, and they're going to have a very different experience, probably from the people who told them to do this, because the people who told them to do this did affirmative asylum, and these people in those other 5 categories are going to have to do defensive asylum. Many of the people in those last 5 categories are going to have to go to ICE and do regular check-ins. They're going to have to stop by an ICE office, their local ICE office, present themselves, and have an ICE officer sign off on their parole document. That's normal, it's parole. Most of us have heard of parole in the context of criminals being released from prison. Obviously, these people aren't criminals, but it's a similar process. There's law enforcement supervision. Some people are given ankle monitoring bracelets or specialized phones that call them every couple minutes. They have to take a picture of their face with it and make sure that they're in possession of the phone and that the phone is tracking them. Another interesting category is the group of people who are given court dates by ICE, but ICE does not then file the paperwork with the court. This is similar to a police officer pulling you over, taking out his ticket book, writing a ticket, giving you your copy, keeping his copy, but not filing the 3rd copy with the court. This is pretty common anymore. So when I have someone who's been given a court date, they have paperwork with a court date, I always check the immigration court online portal and make sure that the thing's even been filed. Because if the court copy hasn't been filed by Border Patrol, you could go to that court date and they're not even going to know why you're there. So those 5 categories of entrants that all have to do defensive proceedings because they've all been given court dates, some of them have been given court dates, but the court doesn't know that they're coming. So that adds another layer of complexity. And finally, the last thing you want to watch for and make sure you're on top of is the class actions. There are multiple class actions right now. In the aftermath of the Trump administration, there was lots of litigation to undo some of the perceived evil of the Trump people. That litigation, in many cases, took the form of class actions filed by and on behalf of aggrieved people trying to get immigration benefits. Membership in some of these class actions can drastically affect the quality of the experience that a non-citizen may have with our immigration system. So you really have to stay on top of that, whether they're eligible for the class actions, whether it's worthwhile to join these class actions, and what class actions are even available. It's very important to stay on top of that. Even further complicating all of this is the fact that everybody has heard stories about the great experience that somebody else had with the affirmative asylum process. Because they want to have the affirmative process in many cases, non-citizens seeking immigration benefits, even with a lawyer like me advising them of this, will refuse to believe that they're going to be put through the defensive process, or refuse to believe that the defensive process is different. In addition, with all these factors going back and forth, affirmative, defensive, parole, court date, passport impounded, charges filed, not filed, all of these things add up to wildly divergent complexity of case and wildly divergent cost. And this makes people very upset too. They all want the same price. They don't want to pay more. They don't want to pay, many want to pay less if they can, of course, but nobody wants to pay more. Nobody wants to hear their case is more complicated than another one. And the earlier generation of immigrants are advising them based on the affirmative procedure, where it is pretty much all the same. There's one affirmative process, and as you can see, there are at least 10 or 12 different defensive processes, each of which has its own ins and outs, some of which may or may not be available to any particular person seeking immigration benefits, but all of which add complexity and cost far in excess of the affirmative process. So what does this come down to? What it comes down to is one simple thing, and you're going to have to treat every single one of these asylum cases coming in over the southern border separately, differently, and with your attention. You can't just treat them all the same. They're not all the same. Many of these people coming in with cases that are absolutely defensive cases think you can just fill out an asylum application and mail it to USCIS. You can't. That's the affirmative process. Because they were not admitted by USCIS, USCIS never had jurisdiction over them, and they can't file anything with USCIS. Their asylum application has to be adjudicated through the court system. And as I've said, you're not only dealing with all this complexity, but with a client that was going to, in most cases, refuse to believe it's real and is going to be advised to refuse to believe it's real by an earlier generation of affirmative asylum seekers. Very, very complicated. Each client will need your individualized attention. You have to pay attention to all these factors. But the defensive asylum game is a far cry from the affirmative process. Everyone's different. They're all very complicated. They're all very expensive, and they're all wildly divergent in what's required. This is immigration attorney Joseph Patrick Murphy with Allegheny Immigration Group. My practice involves primarily family-based and humanitarian immigration, including defensive asylum applications. If you know someone, if you are someone, or if you love someone who came across the southern border and has been given immigration papers by Border Patrol, give me a call. My office number is 412-521-2000. My cell, text, and WhatsApp are all the same number, 412-973-3442. Joseph Patrick Murphy, Allegheny Immigration Group, handling defensive asylum claims. This is Joseph Patrick Murphy. Thank you for watching.